find this palace beautiful is if I find that it is beautiful. In other words, if the mere representation of the object in itself, within itself, pleases me, if it produces in me a pleasure, however indifferent I may remain to the existence of that object. It is quite plain that in order to say that the object is beautiful and to show that I have taste, everything turns on the meaning which I can give to this representation, and not on any factor which makes me dependent on the real existence of the object.
Derrida is cutting Kant's idea of aesthetics in sections to really get inside. In order to appreciate something beautiful, in Kant's idea of aesthetics is that you have to detach from that thing intellectually, practically, and emotionally. So the question is, if I detach from that thing, I'm not interested in any aspect of that object, how do I even be interested in that object? Or how do I even have a desire to appreciate that object? But in Kant's idea, unless you detach yourself from the object emotionally, intellectually, you wouldn't be able to appreciate its pure beauty. That sounds crazy or impractical. But this idea has been in the Western traditional aesthetic since Kant's time. So of course Americans say, but I don't look at it that way. That's why Europeans think Americans are all uncultured and uneducated.
A disinterested pleasure. The formula is too well known. Too received, as is the refusal it has never ceased to provoke. Anger of Nietzsche and Artaud, disinterest or uninterestedness are supererogatory. Meditative murmur from Heidegger. At the end of the origin, pleasure is superfluous or insufficient. This pleasure is purely subjective. In the aesthetic judgment, it does not designate anything about the object. But its subjectivity is not an existence, nor even a relation to existence. It is an inexistent or anexistent subjectivity, arising on the crypt of the empirical subject and its whole world. But a subjectivity which nevertheless enjoys. No, does not enjoy. Kant distinguishes pleasure from enjoyment. Takes pleasure. No, for it receives it just as much. If the translation of Wohlgefallen by pleasure is not entirely rigorous, and that by satisfaction even less so, the pleasing risks leaning toward the agreeable and letting us think that everything comes from the object which pleases. In truth, the Wohlgefallen, I please myself, but without complacence. I do not interest myself, especially not in myself insofar as I exist. I please myself in, not in anything that exists, not in doing something or other. I please myself in, pleasing myself in, that which is beautiful, insofar as it does not exist.
With this view, Nietzsche and Artaud and Heidegger all think, man, that sounds crazy. Basically, that's what they're saying. Heidegger says that the pleasure is superfluous, of insufficient. That's how they react to Kant's classics. So on one hand, you have to be pleased by something, by an object. But at the same time, you have to detach from that object in any possible way. Still, you need to be pleased by that object in the sense of pure beauty. That's why we call it German idealism. As Parergon says, idealism. So it's all in your mind. Derrida said, head first.
It is a pure heteroaffection. The purely subjective effect is provoked by what is called the beautiful, that which is said to be beautiful, outside, and the object and independently of its existence. Whence the critical and indispensable character of this recourse to judgment. The structure of autoaffection is such that it connects itself with a pure objectivity of which one must say it is beautiful, and this statement has universal validity. We know that Kant rejects the notion of imitation, at least initially. As for homoousios or adequatio, the matter becomes, to say the least, complicated as soon as one is dealing no longer with a determinate judgment, but with a reflective judgment, and as soon as the res in question does not exist, or in any case is not considered in its existence as a thing. It is at the end of a quite different itinerary that we shall verify the efficacy of these values, mimesis, homoiosis, adequatio, in Kant's discourse.
Derrida made it very clear that it no longer depends on any phenomena, empiricity of any determined existence, whether that of the object or that of the subject. My empiricity relating me precisely to the existence of the beautiful object or to the existence of my sensory motivation. As we repeat this, now we're in a kind of misa enemy. We begin to chase our tail again. I can't attach, I can't be interested, I can't even feel about this thing. But I have to have raised my desire, my interest, in order to be able to appreciate its beauty. Well, that only leads to a very simple reaction, which is most modern people have. I like it. You see how far we've been led by this sort of idea so deeply in our blood for the last 200 years. It's not that we just simply dwelling on our egotism. It's that we have a tradition that not only encouraged us, but also trained us, educated us to go this way. That's why also you can see your political leaders can say anything they want. Doesn't matter that makes sense or not. So if you can appreciate something beautiful that way, also you can assert something right or wrong in the same way. Why not? We're stuck. So this traditional view, mimesis, representation, the mediation between the objects and ourselves, and the only connection so we can relate ourselves to the world, in the sense, I as the subject, to relate to the object, the outside the world. How are we going to do that? You can't melt yourself into the outside of the world. Or as the Chinese like to say, unified with the nature. How are you going to do that? You can't become part of the tree or become part of the rock. Even you love to, you can't do that. And you can't take those things in yourself either. You can't say, I'm going to plant this tree inside of me. We need representation. That's what the Greek already laid out for us. But by Kant's time, there's another way. We can get this whole thing down in our mind. We don't need to go anywhere. We just go in deep in our mind and we solve the problem. Hegel also thinks that way. That's where Heidegger begins to say, wait, there's something we're forgetting here. How about the life? How about the existence? How about the being?
Almost nothing remains to me, neither the thing nor its existence, nor mine, neither the pure object nor the pure subject. No interest of anything that is in anything that is. And yet I like. No, that's still going too far. That's still taking an interest in existence, no doubt. I do not like, but I take pleasure in what does not interest me, in something of which it is at least a matter of indifference whether I like it or not. I do not take this pleasure that I take. It would seem rather that I return it. I return what I take. I receive what I return. I do not take what I receive. And yet I give it to myself. Can I say that I give it to myself? What is it to exist for Kant? To be present, according to space and time, as an individual thing, according to the conditions of the transcendental aesthetic. There is nothing less aesthetic in this sense than the beautiful object which must not interest us, qua aestheton. But this aesthetic in existence must affect me, and that is why the retention of the word aesthetic is justified from the start.
All you have to do, dive in your mind. You solve the problem. Derrida asks, what is it to exist for Kant? To be present. There is something that has to be present. So now we're talking about the presence. Of course, it's an old Greek idea again. But to Kant, that presence is slightly different because Kant wants to utilize or enclose everything in the mind. He does not want to have any association or any close association or connection to outside. Everything has to be inside. That's why Derrida keeps saying misa enemy, because it is an enclosed abyssal space. Here Derrida used the example of reading a book versus to look at plastic art. So you look at a sculpture, you look at a painting. There's no spatial requirement. You can look at a sculpture from back, front, left, or right. You can look at a painting from above or below. It really doesn't matter. But you can't read a book from any page that you decide to start. because the entire systematic of understanding and thinking will be taken away. Derrida's idea is essentially Kant built his discourse on the discourse, not so much based on the painting or the so-called plastic art. You might come down to a point to say, I don't even need to look at this piece of art. I'm just going to write by the piece of art. But whatever the art appears to be, it's not too much my concern. All I need to do is to get this pure pleasure, the pure sense that it's beautiful. And I continue, carry on.
But a book, and a book of philosophy, if it is a book of metaphysics in the Kantian sense, hence a book of pure philosophy, one can in principle enter it from any point. It is a sort of architecture. In the third critique, there is pure philosophy, there is talk of it, and its plan is drawn. In terms of the analogy, but how to measure its terms, one ought to be able to begin anywhere and follow any order. Although the quantity and the quality, the force of the reading may depend, as with a piece of architecture, on the point of view and on a certain relation to the ideal limit, which acts as a frame.
Derrida's idea is that essentially you cannot use philosophy to, colonize art. You can't enslave art. Traditionally, art is the made of religion. So in other words, religion enslaves art. And by Renaissance, humanism liberates art from religion. A few hundred years later, by Kant's time, we begin to talk about art for art. It used to be art for religion. But now we have another problem. Philosophy enslaves art. And if you really read the third critique, so far we have only read a few paragraphs from Derrida's book. We already got that flavor. Philosophy has to enslave art. Philosophy has to dominate art. It's very hard to achieve that. And that's why Derrida begin to say, here's the book, and here is the plastic art. How are you going to equate those two things? There are two different things. That's essentially Derrida's idea. He's challenging Kant, or he's challenging the third critique.
Common scientific or logical discourse proceeds by determinate judgments. In the example follows in order to determine, or with a pedagogical intention to illustrate. In art and in life, wherever one must, according to Kant, proceed to reflective judgments and assume, by analogy with art, we shall come to this rule further on, a finality, the concept of which we do not have, the example precedes. There follows a singular historicity, and, counting the simulacrum time, a certain regulated relative picture of the theoretical. On the authority of this reflective hinge, I begin my reading of the third critique with some examples. Aesthetic, just like theoretical, logical judgments, are divisible into empirical and pure. The first are those by which agreeableness or disagreeableness, the second those by which beauty is predicated of an object or its mode of representation. The former are judgments of sense, material aesthetic judgments, the latter as formal alone judgments of taste proper. A judgment of taste, therefore, is only pure so far as its determining ground is tainted with no merely empirical delight. But such a taint is always present where charm or emotion have a share in judgment, by which something is to be described as beautiful.
So the question here is this. A judgment of taste, therefore, is only pure so far as its determining ground is tainted with no merely empirical delight. That's the key. But such a taint is always present where charm or emotion have a share in the judgment, by which something is to be described as beautiful. So this is the trick. You can't really feel or think anything about this object. However, everything that you come up to the point that you can give a pure or receive a pure understanding of the beauty of the object, that function itself based on the things you already detached. So that's what this part is. So your judgment or your judgment of taste has to be pure. That is not related to any empirical experience or interests. However, to process this pure judgment of test, that everything is based on your empirical experience or insight or your relation. Because Kant is part of the great canons of our civilization. It's very hard to challenge or even to question this canon. Derrida has laid out this big battle from beginning to Parergon. Particularly, we keep talking about mise en abîme. He has to lay out this big field to let you walk into the maze. You think Derrida tries to trap me in his writing. No, it's not Derrida trying to trap you. It's Kant already trapped you in his thinking. You just don't know that.
All form of objects of sense, both of external and also immediately of internal sense, is either figure or play. In the latter case, it is either play of figures, in space, mimic and dance, or mere play of sensations, in time. The charm of colors, or of the agreeable tones of instruments, may be added, but the design in the former and the composition in the latter constitute the proper object of the pure judgment of taste. Even what is called ornamentation, that is, what is only an adjunct, and not an intrinsic constituent in the complete representation of the object, in augmenting the delight of taste, does so only by means of its form. Thus it is with the frames of pictures, or the drapery on statues, or the colonnades of palaces. But if the ornamentation does not itself enter into the composition of the beautiful form, if it is introduced, like a gold frame, merely to win approval for the picture by means of its charm, it is then called finery, and takes away from the genuine beauty.
Derrida raised a very good question here. The Western philosophy, particularly after Kantian aesthetic, that is all based on a hierarchical order. You may say, you never think an oil painting is less than its frame. I mean, think about this. In the museum, all the great masters' oil paintings, with their frames being replaced how many times? Rarely you're going to have an original painting by Da Vinci and you would have the frame originally equipped with that painting. It's almost impossible in some sense, whatever the reason that was. And that also tells us the painting is always more important than the frame. And that's what we spend so much time reading the first few sections from this book, Ergon, Parergon. Essentially, Derrida's idea here is this. His question, or rather, is can a painting exist without a frame? You see, that's another issue. No matter how much we can hold a prejudice against the frames in order to protect paintings, but we can't display a painting without a frame. In our mind, we have this prejudice. Painting is more important than frame, but in reality, it does not always work that way. Even you still think the painting is more important than the frame, but you cannot do it without a frame. So Derrida is essentially trying to lead you to a place you recognize that the entire system is a set of concepts, set of conditions, set of objects work together, rather than the hierarchical order that a painting leads everything else. Rather, painting works with the frame, museum, audience, market even. Not mentioning the social condition. That's where he's trying to lead you to recognize or to at least take a look from this view.